Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to, happy Pride, first of all. My name's Alex. I'm the Global Insights and Content Manager here at LGBT Great. I'm delighted today to be joined by Mark McLane from M&G. And thank you to everyone who's joining. The session today, we just wanted to take a moment to have a conversation, really, for it to be open, to be frank, to be honest, and to give you people who are joining and in the audience an opportunity to pick our brains, and for me to pick Mark's brain on kind of Pride and what it means and why we're here and what we hope Pride can be and should be. So that's my little opening spiel. But Mark, I'm sure people do know you, but for those that don't, it'd be great just to hear a little bit about you and your role and kind of what it is that we're here today to do from your perspective.
Well, Alex, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone actually at LGBT Great for the work that you do around LGBT plus inclusion, particularly in the investments and asset management sector. And that's really important, for me. My role as head of diversity, inclusion, and well-being at M&G is about exactly that, right? Not just making M&G a great place to work, but really more broadly, the sector, right? And make certain that it's welcoming, and make certain that colleagues and customers and investors, everyone who identifies within the broader LGBT community, can be themselves, right? Myself being an out executive, I've gone through that journey in the consumer products industry, in banking when I was the global head of diversity at Barclays, and now at M&G, and I want to help make certain, right, that others can bring their whole self to work regardless of how they identify. And that's part of our conversation today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, reflecting on that for me, as someone who is out at work as well, this idea of bringing myself to work and, as a grad and, now as I slide up the greasy pole of corporate life, I'm constantly reflecting on ways in which I can support people on my teams to be out and to bring their authentic selves to work, because you've done it. You're leading those teams, and as someone who sits within teams like that, it's amazing to feel that you can bring your authentic self to work. And from an LGBT great perspective, there is no better place to be. I get to do this as my full-time job, but that's not always the case, right? So, lots of people are tackling with all these busy, stressful lives and stressful jobs, and then the stress of having to come out and to be out and proud at work, whether that's, in an environment that is supportive or not supportive, in a country that's supportive or not supportive. So for me, the fact that we're even having this conversation today is wonderful. And, I'm delighted to be part of that conversation, particularly growing up. I was outed at school, for example. So, having that empowering, there's no sound. Can everyone else hear us on the call? You could wouldn't mind popping in the chat that we can. Okay, great. So Emma, it may just be an issue. Okay, thanks. Maybe I'd say rejoin. Thank you everyone. But yeah, as I was saying, as someone who was outed at school, for me, this idea of empowering people in the workplace to be their authentic selves and to be unashamedly themselves is something that's really, really important to me personally. So, just reflecting on that, and I think it's great. But I suppose maybe if we can start off with a big question, what I might do actually is stop sharing so that people can see us. It's Pride Month, right? It's Global Pride Month around the world. There's organizations are talking about this, events are happening, etc. I just wanted to get your perspective really on what does Pride kind of mean to you, and why do you think it's still important that we even have these conversations around Pride?
Yeah, so this is the big question,
right?
Every year, right? That we hear, is Pride still relevant?
Yeah.
And it absolutely is. Has Pride changed? Sure it has. But so have the challenges across our community changed. And Pride needs to be that vehicle by which we continue to open the dialogue for greater equity and equality across the constituencies within the broader LGBT community. right? Because today it's not just about being gay or lesbian, trans. You add all of the other components of diversity within our community, including age.
Yeah,
Right?
definitely.
Listen, I'm part of a generation, right, that lives through the HIV and AIDS crisis.
Yeah.
And I'm now part of a generation that's facing retirement for the first time, right? And being out in retirement. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Because the individuals that I grew up with and lost during the 80s, right? There aren't those role models.
Yeah.
Add to that the complexity of marriage and divorce within our community. Faith, ethnicity, right? So it's really, Pride is about making certain that we as a community are staying together and looking at the impact of legislation, the impact of equality on the transgender community, right? The impact that retirement is going to have for an older generation, the understanding of what it means to not come out, to just be out in a younger generation, which is a very different dynamic. Coming, right? It's not my experience, but I also believe I have a responsibility in understanding that. And that's what Pride is about today. It's about continuing to move equality in our community forward. Is it different? Yes. Is there still, some people like to say, a fight to be had? I see it more as a continuing journey, right? For equality, is that you have to keep the dialogue in the forefront. You have to keep it up to date. You have to understand what's happening in and to our community. And Pride is a great way to continue to bring allies into that conversation. I know we're going to talk about allies.
We are, yeah.
we can't talk about Pride without talking about allyship, and a vehicle by which others continue to understand the struggles within the community and from outside the community. And that's where allyship continues to come forward, right? If you look at an organization like PFLAG, and it was allies coming together to better understand how they could support the community, right? And Pride can continue to be that vehicle by which we all come together to continue to learn, to continue to understand that although equality has moved forward, there's still work to be done.
I really like this idea of seeing Pride as a journey rather than as a kind of, as an arbitrary thing or as a fight. I mean, originally it was I don't think it still is highly politicized. It's still highly related to advocacy, and it should be. But I think for me, that's one element, and then there's a lot else that goes beside it. That even just researching for this series of webinars that LGBT Great's doing throughout Pride, I was struck by the humanity of the activists, and it was a political statement, of course, but it was more about the people. It was more about those communities coming together, and it was more about, I was thinking about the fact that, when we think about LGBT history, we maybe think about gay history, think about lesbian history and trans history all in isolation, but they're not. It's an entire community. It's a shared experience. And as you mentioned, this idea of intersectionality, right? The way that different parts of the community relate to each other through race, through gender, through age, through ability and disability, I think is very important. And so,
look, Pride is a global message. Right? And it wasn't 20, 25, 30, 50 years ago. It wasn't a global message, but it has grown to be a global message. And there's a real positive knock-on value to that in countries where Pride may still be illegal. Right? It gives individuals in those countries something to aspire to do or aspire to help their country, their community become. Right? And so if you look at it across the continuum, right? Pride in some countries is in the very beginnings of that political fight and struggle to now a celebration of equality in other countries and a recognition that there's still work to be done, right? So Pride is about the continuum of equality, but it's become a global message. And I think sometimes we forget that we always look inward, or we only look at Pride in London, or we only look at Pride in New York, or we only look at Pride in Brighton.
Sure.
Right. Versus the collective power that Pride has had and continues to have and needs to continue to have.
I think that's a very good point, isn't it, about, you know, the kind of privileged position that we have in some of these environments that are very mature, or much more mature in terms of their journey through Pride, right? I was speaking to someone today, actually, on a call about Lithuania, and how that they had been involved in the first big Lithuanian Pride, you know, in the last 10 years, and that they had been pivotal in driving forward the inclusion of sexual orientation as a protected characteristic within the constitution, and that was in the last 10 years, and they're in my generation. So, you know, I think you're absolutely right, and that one thing we can't forget is that Pride is a journey, and people are at different points in that journey, and our responsibility as a global community is to ensure that no matter where you are in that journey, that you have the tools to get to the next stage, right? So if you're in your early stage, then you may need more support. If you're in the later stage, maybe you need more support in a different way. So I think this idea of a globalized movement, you know, is critical. No, I completely agree with you there. It's how have you seen kind of Pride evolve over the last few years in the kind of, you know, working world?
Yeah, I think Pride has given, like I said earlier, allies an opportunity as individuals, but it's also given allies as companies an opportunity to support the community much more visibly, right? And coming together. If you look at how large Pride in London has become over the last few years, right? And look, there's always two sides to the argument of, has the commercialization of Pride taken away from Pride? And I don't really have a position on either end of those arguments. I look at Pride and think, but you have now organizations, right? Large corporations, large banks, large travel companies saying, we support our LGBT plus community at M&G, right? In my organization, without name dropping others. But that support then doesn't waver. That support continues to put out a message to governments, right? To individuals as consumers, and we're all consumers. Who do you want to spend your money with? Do you want to spend your money with an organization that will support you and your community? Or do you want to spend your money without having that knowledge? I choose to be a savvy consumer. I do, right? If you wouldn't want me to work for you, why would I spend my money with you? My father ran petrol stations, the name not to be mentioned in the United States. Noted. Right? And you all can, I'm sure, Google this really easily. But you know, growing up, I always had that petrol card when I was in university. And one day I said to my dad, I was like, I just can't. They don't support domestic partner benefits. They don't support their LGBT workforce. And he looked at me and said, you have to make the decisions that are best for you. Right. And there's the support of an ally. Right? It's really having that understanding. We talk about, you know, rainbow washing. Rainbow washing stops when consumers realize who is and who isn't supportive of us as a community. And then where do you put your money? Right. And I think Pride continues to help uncover that. Right. So if you look at it in that way, okay, the big FTSE 100 companies and FTSE 250 companies are putting their support out there publicly, which is what we've asked for, right? Recognizing me as a consumer and the value I bring to that, and also as a welcoming place to work. And if that's not true and correct, it's uncovered pretty quickly. Since think of the power that Pride has in doing that today. Right? Very
much so. It's interesting, isn't it? This idea that, you know, LGBT plus inclusion doesn't stop, you know, at the door to your office. It's in your products, it's in your services. You know, I think that's something that people forget, is that LGBT plus inclusion isn't just for the workplace. It's expressed publicly. It's expressed with clients, with investors. And you raise a really interesting point there around financial services, right? Because I think, now LGBT great, for those that don't know, hello, we work almost exclusively with financial services companies, asset management, insurers, banks, etc. And one thing I've been overwhelmed by already is the maturity of the programs like M&G and others on how sophisticated the LGBT plus DE&I program is. But what that means is that actually financial services isn't this sort of bastion of conservatism and this, in the way you might have thought about it in kind of times gone by. But actually, because these organizations are so big, because they're so global, because they are investing in all of swathes of markets and society, that LGBT plus inclusion and diversity and support just doesn't stop at the gate to the office. It extends into the market. And that for me was a really interesting realization, just that it is integrated, right, the external and the internal. And I think you talk about rainbow washing and the consumerism, and I was struck by that. Recently I bought Pride merchandise and stuff, but I did exactly what you did. I looked at whether the proceeds were actually going to organizations that were supporting LGBT causes globally, and that influenced my purchasing. So in a pool of one, I'm exactly.
You're one in a pool of many.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Again, being savvy consumers and being able to be out in the workplace, being able to be myself in the workplace, and your point about the integration of our LGBT strategy being about being welcoming for colleagues at MG should rightly have a trickle effect into being supportive of our business and being a resource to our business and being open in the workplace. I'm at least have been called upon as that resource in the past. I remember being at working for a big bank. The head of the retail bank at one point said to me, "Mark, I want to be known as the most inclusive bank."
Right.
And we were talking about Pride and work with another LGBT nonprofit organization. And in a meeting, he said to me, so for those of you who don't know, I have a consumer products background also. He said, "Mark, before we even get started, do we have the right products for the LGBT community?" And I said, "Anthony, we do, but you don't talk to me like a consumer." He said, "Explain that to me." I said, "Well, it's not that you exclude me, but I don't see myself."
Yeah.
I said, "So it's about me being able to identify Mark McLane in your products and services, and that they do apply to me, and that not only that, that as an organization, you have an understanding of how they apply to me." Now, the same conversation, right, at M&G is how do we approach retirement? And what products do we have? And how savvy are we? And this is a constant learning process. But it's about, when you hear companies say, we want to reflect our communities and our customers, right? That's the value you get in doing that. Having the voice in the room, right? The trusted voice of me being able to say, look, Carlos and I retiring is very different.
Yeah.
Straight couple retiring, because we do still have to take into account certain legal considerations, right? From beneficiary laws and other things that haven't quite caught up to marriage equality and will, back to why Pride needs to continue to move, to
evolve, of course.
But that's really the value in it. That's the value in an organization. If the organization's strategy is about not only having the voice in the room, but hearing the voice, right?
That's the critical thing, isn't it? It's about.
And look, you said it earlier, right? You coming out as a student, and being out as a student was different than being out as a grad, and being out as a grad was different than being out in your role today. Right? Well, being out for me in the United States was different than being out in the UK.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And, look, the UK was the first the first time that I was publicly out
Sure.
on the FTSE, or what was it, the Financial Times top 50 out executives in London. And I was asked to do that by Suki Sandhu.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
When he headed that. And I said, I'm just not all about lists.
Yeah.
And Suki said, no, Mark, it's about role modeling.
Yeah.
It's about, right? So we had that conversation. And I thought, I do have a responsibility of being visibly out in financial services. If what I'm trying to do as an individual and as a senior executive is help make the industry more welcoming, I have to show that it is welcoming.
That's a really interesting point, I think, around role modeling and LGBT Great. We have, and as you know, you're on quite a few of them, role modeling programs. And my reflections on that is that I completely agree. It's having role models that are visible, but it's also about the organization empowering them to speak openly, to have the tools and protections that they need in order to, as we said earlier, bring their full selves to work. But I think you're right. It's about creating spaces for those people to speak in their own words. It's about, it's not for me to talk about what it's like to be a trans person of color at work. It's not for me to talk about that, but it's my role as an ally to ensure that there is a space where that conversation can be had and can be forwarded and can be, as you mentioned, can be heard. And that I completely agree here. And I think, for everyone on the call, I would encourage you to, if you can, create spaces for people to speak, whether that's by just asking someone, oh, what does it mean when you say, oh, my pronouns are they, them? What does that mean to you? What do you want me to take away from this? By having those conversations proactively, giving space to have those conversations is so important. And I think during Pride, I'm certainly reflecting on the need for role models, but as you say, the need to listen.
You listen, LGBT Great today published a list of 100 role models.
We did.
Right? You called them game changers, but they're role models. I have two colleagues, Pauline and Scott, who have been recognized, and they're absolutely role models in what they do, how they do it, why they step up within M&G to lead our Pride network. Right? They could spend their time anywhere. They choose to invest it back into us as an organization, which is being a role model, right? And we need multiple role models because we need to be able to identify, right? So it goes back to that conversation of, we've got the right products at this bank, but you don't talk to me like a consumer. I don't see myself there. That's what's so important about having role models and why we have to continue that, right? There's also a generational component to role modeling, right? To be able to reach out to me and say, Mark, how did you sort of path your career is a very different conversation than asking Pauline or Scott, who are in a different place, or yourself, who's in a different place in your career, to be able to say, how do you navigate? Why did you make the choices that you make? And then it's the opportunity, as you said, to open up a conversation so I can understand as an individual, where does my allyship need to sit within the community?
Absolutely. And I think that's a super interesting point around, I think there's a directionality to this, right? So it's, about going for is osmosis, or go from a high concentration of understanding to a low concentration. And I think that works in both ways. I think this idea of role modeling, of mentoring, is completely bilateral. It's, learning from people like yourself who are, the stage you are in your career, and it's about looking to people just coming into the workplace. What does it mean to be an open LGBT person at work when you're 19, or when you're a grad? And I think these conversations happening both ways is, for me, something that's really important. And LGBT Great has a mentoring program, and we do a lot of reverse mentoring as well, where we get someone who's fresh out of university and someone who, an ally, an executive that doesn't know how to navigate those conversations, put them in a room, let them hash it out, and then, at the end of it, there's a mutually beneficial relationship that's been established. And
I think you bring up a really great point, Alex, about reverse mentoring. And that's even within our own community.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
And I'm going to continue to pound on the multi-generational aspect of our community today, because I think there is a great opportunity for the cross-generational
Yeah.
learning, right?
Yeah,
And
definitely.
all of our experiences. So I talked in the very beginning about living through the HIV and AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
And if we just talk about HIV today in our community and why testing and all of that is still so important, but generationally, it's a very different view, right? I grew up seeing an HIV positive diagnosis as a death sentence. And today it's used as a chronic illness.
Yeah.
And that's a huge shift, right? In a very positive way. But just even having that understanding, I forget what it was. Recently, someone said, have you watched a certain series? And it was about the HIV.
Oh, it's crisis. A sin.
It's a sin.
Yeah.
And I said, I just can't.
Yeah.
Right now, right? Because I relive that in a way that I don't really want to.
Of course.
And just even having that understanding and being able to verbalize that is really important. You and I talked before this about the use of inclusive language. I know it's on our agenda, but just having this conversation makes me even think about the word queer.
Right.
And again, understanding that growing up, being called queer was so derogatory that as queer came back into the LGBT community conversation in a more positive way to identify, it took me a little bit of time to just go, I've got to understand this, right? So even watching and understanding the queer community sort of coming out as queer gave me a new confidence to use the word in a way that it doesn't give me the negative reaction that I had growing up, although I still don't want to identify as queer. I identify as gay.
Yeah.
And I think having those dialogues within our community and understanding the use of language and how that changes over time also then helps to make our allies more comfortable, right? Because if you're not part of the community, but you are supportive of the community, one of the things you want to make sure is you don't inadvertently offend someone by using the wrong language. And I know I've talked to straight allies who are hypersensitive about that.
Yeah.
So really being able to have this open conversation of saying, listen, even within our own community, right, we have to gain an understanding of how Alex wants to identify versus how I want to identify, and that it's okay to have this continuum. That puts our allies at ease to be able to ask the questions, as you said earlier, really listen, gain knowledge. It also should put us as a community at ease that if someone uses a term incorrectly, you can have that conversation, right? That they're not necessarily doing out of malice of intent. They're doing it out of a lack of knowledge.
Definitely. No, I completely agree. And it's interesting. I do identify as queer as well as gay, and for me, that is a part of my identity that is almost an expression of belonging, right? So it's saying there's a shared history here. There's a collective memory that I want to be part of. And it's saying that people who are across the whole spectrum of gender identity, I identify as a cis, I'm a cis male, so I'm quite clear and set, in kind of my identification. But for me, it's about acknowledging that as a queer person, that I am part of a community. And I think for me, Pride is an expression of that community spirit, and it's an expression that we as a community, as a queer community, doesn't matter how you identify, it doesn't matter to me. It's about coming together and ensuring that we all have the same rights. It's about equality. It's about ensuring that we all have the spaces to speak and we are heard and listened to. And it's about fighting. It's about working together, collaborating, and I think probably fighting as well, to ensure that everyone, through whoever identifies as queer, has the same access to the same things, this, and I can leverage also, we probably should mention the word privilege as well, that I can leverage my privilege as a cis white male to empower others in the queer community as well. So I think allyship, as and language are so interconnected here. And
it absolutely is. It's not, I think probably the first conversation I had about identifying as queer was with Joe Galliano, who is the CEO and founder of Queer Britain.
Yeah,
and I was just talking to Joe earlier this week. I was telling him that I had the honor of doing this conversation with you. And we were exactly talking about this use of language more inclusively, but understanding even within our own community. And I said, just having Queer Britain, right, as a space, really starts to expand and help define what it means, right, to be the queer community and all of the richness that really umbrellas over in that conversation. And again, bringing allies into that conversation, I think, is so important. I also think so much more visibility of the queer community in entertainment today.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And having role models growing up, right, and being able to see a community, again, that is so broadly diverse across all aspects of ethnicity and faith, age, everything that the community brings together is really important. And it comes back to Pride should be partly celebrant of that, but also one of the keepers of making certain that progress continues, because there are a lot of places, right, within our community, a lot of individuals within our community that don't have equality today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, be allies for each other.
Absolutely.
And understand what that means. Okay. And you said the fight. Sometimes it is a political fight, right? Sometimes it is a bit of a demonstration. Other times it's about having a quiet word with the right people at the right time. And we have to be able to do all of that to keep progress moving forward. You also talk about privilege, right? And I am privileged as a gay white man. And I recognize that. And that's also why I'm an ally within our community and also outside of our community.
100%.
I was asked a few years ago now by PFLAG in the United States. PFLAG had always had co-chairs for their annual gala that's held in New York. And it was always two straight allies, because that's how PFLAG was built. And the individuals who were running PFLAG at the time had rung me up and said, Mark, what do you think about next year if we have a straight executive and an out executive as co-hosts for the event? And I said, I think it's time, right? I think it was their 50th year anniversary. And they said, so do we, but why do you think it's time? And I said, I think it's time that you have a gay executive stand up and say thank you. Okay, to the allies in the room. Okay. I said, look, I'm very well aware I have the privilege of straight allyship, making workplaces more inclusive for me to be able to progress in my career, to help remove some of those barriers. And I said, and I think you should, that's what someone should stand up and say. You've got to watch what you say when you're asked questions like that, because then 2 days later, the phone rang and they said, well, we'd like you to do it. And I was really, I was privileged on the evening to just stand up with a senior executive in the US and just say thank you to the audience, right? And then that you have to take the privilege that you have and then make certain you're pulling others along with you. And this goes back to being a good ally.
Absolutely.
But I also have to listen to your perspective to understand what it is you're trying to achieve, not make an assumption. I know what that's like. I don't know what it's like.
Absolutely. I think, reflecting on allyship is really interesting. I think, I completely agree that, allies don't realize, maybe they don't realize just quite how impactful those small things are, for example, I have trans friends who said, "Oh, Alex, it was good to see that you put your pronouns in your Instagram bio." And I was like, "Oh yeah, sure, it was no problem." And it's like, but no, but you don't understand, because what you've done is you're ensuring that there's a space here to talk about this, and then, you know, by you doing it, that then normalizes my experience, and then it makes it easier. So, you know, I think one thing for me about allyship is that allyship is for everyone. Allyship is for people in the community, the LGBT community, and outside. And, you know, I'm a very, you know, outspoken trans ally, and, you know, this is not a one-time thing either. It's not a single action. I can't boil it down to being an ally. There are some actions I can do as an ally, you know, regularly to demonstrate my allyship, but it's not a one-time thing. It's a commitment, isn't it? It's a journey as well.
And sometimes being a great ally is just saying, I don't know.
Oh yeah, 100%.
So, you know, I refer to myself sometimes as the CGO, the Chief Gay Officer. Right? Being out and as visible as I am, people asking me sort of all the questions of the community, and I don't have those answers. And being a good ally is actually saying that, actually, I don't know. If you're asking me potentially about what it's like to be a transgender woman in financial services, I said, but I'm going to reach out to our colleagues and have them tell us how we're doing, have them help us continue to understand why certain benefits are so important to the transgender community that aren't important to me because they don't have the same impact on my life. And this is that listening component, right? And as good allies, the more we listen, the more informed we become, right? And the more we can help move that conversation along. But I think really that first critical step is just saying you don't know. And your point is you're never quite sure, right, what impact you're going to have until you do it. And I remember having a conversation with a colleague of mine, Sinise, who's vice president of diversity and inclusion at Barclays, and she won't mind me telling this story. A few years ago, during International Women's Day, I said, you know, we're doing some great work, but I don't really see a 20-something woman who's in our business. We're not reflecting, right, that demographic. And I just said, well, Sinise has now just been promoted to a branch, I think a regional branch manager at the time. And I was like, she's a brilliant role model, right? Came in as a grad, has worked. So I rang her up and I said, Sinise, would you mind being a part of this work that we're doing for International Women's Day? And she said, no, I'd love to. And I saw her at the event, and she came over and she said, can I give you a hug? And I was like, you know, absolutely. And I said, what did I do to deserve this, right? And she said, you asked me to be a part of the campaign. I said, why wouldn't I? You're an amazing role model. Look at, you know, you're a regional banking manager. And she said, yeah, but Mark, it's the first time someone's asked me to show up as a woman, not just a transgender woman. She said, I am really proud to be a transgender woman, and you know that. She said, but you just rang me up and said, will you represent the community? And I was like, wow. She said, thanks. I was like, no, thank you.
I think that no thank you is my feeling on that as well. You know, that's an amazing story. It's
those moments of us reaching to each other, including each other, that you don't realize. Your pronouns, for you, it was like, well, of course I'm going to put my pronouns in my, right? It's when you hear the impact you're having because of the, sometimes what you think are the simple steps we're taking as individuals have a positive ripple effect. You can't underestimate that.
No, 100%.
Can't underestimate whether I see myself as a role model or not. Someone else is watching what I do, what Alex does, why Alex does it that way. Okay. We are role modeling, and it's those simple steps, and it's the collective positive impact those simple steps have, right? That we don't necessarily see on a daily basis, but collectively you see over time. That's really important.
No, completely agree. I'm conscious we've hit 40 minutes already, which I could keep talking about this all day. I'm conscious that we wanted to open out to any questions. So
Yeah.
for people who are on the call, please drop any questions you would like us to cover here, and we'll cover those off. One of the ones that I did want to get to was someone asked about, we've talked about big organizations like M&G that have dedicated functions, etc. But for those smaller organizations that maybe don't have representation of someone who's out, or even anyone who's in the LGBT community, how can smaller organizations that are more that's more stressful to actually find those role models, how can they navigate the same conversations really?
So I think in smaller organizations, I'm going to have to make a couple of assumptions, right?
Sure.
And the first assumption is that you have organizational communications in some way.
Yeah.
And that would be my starting point. So even if it's the intranet,
sure,
and you're an ally for the community, just say, as an organization, why wouldn't we put up an intranet article during the month of Pride, just about the importance of Pride? Now, again, may seem like a really small step, but if it's the first step, it's a signal to others, right, that you are a welcoming organization, or that you as an individual who've written the article, right, support the LGBT plus community in some way, right? That for me is a great starting point. And that's the same as a few colleagues coming together and saying, we want to start a Pride network.
Yeah.
It has to start somewhere, and regardless of the size of the organization. So I would look for those opportunities, and then do it potentially on a more consistent basis. Just look and say, okay, it's Pride Month. There's Ida Hobbit.
Yeah.
Right. An Ida Hobbit article about what does it even mean? What does Ida Hobbit stand for? Why is it important? It can be a few simple paragraphs. That is a positive signal that organizationally there are allies, right? It also helps to start to test the organization's desire, right, to be inclusive, because you're going to potentially open up a conversation for the first time ever.
Yeah.
Now, look, if that's closed down, you as an individual then have to decide, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. Yeah. Right? Yeah. No, that's really interesting, isn't it? It's like, if it's not there already in a small organization and you notice it, be the agent of change,
The agent of change, right? Or at least if you are thinking about this, it's important to you in some way.
Yeah.
As an individual, you know where you stand and you understand the culture of the organization better. And that should help you then decide, how do you want to be? Where do you want to be? This goes back to being a good consumer. Being a good consumer isn't just about buying your next smartphone, right? It's about how you question organizations that you want to work for, right?
Yeah.
So look, when I interviewed here in the UK with my first job, I interviewed them as much as they interviewed me.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? And that's being a good consumer. This is the other way of uncovering it, right? Is to push the agenda forward with just a simple step. And then if that's accepting, see where it goes,
Marginal gain, right? Every, reflect over the last, the 10 steps that you've made, and you've come a whole leap.
Absolutely.
I'm conscious of time. So, we had a question come through. In my company, we've run webinars getting colleagues more used to LGBT language and how to be effective. What further steps would you recommend to keep allies engaged with the community? That's probably quite a good way to kind of finish, is, how do you keep engagement throughout Pride? Pride, we've talked about Pride today, but it's the first day of a month. But really, Pride is not just for a month, it's every day.
I would say, look, if you have allies in your organization, Pride is a great way to kick off the LGBT year.
Yeah.
Not the month. Okay. And then talk to them, interview them, ask them what they've really very simple questions about. What have you learned being an ally? What brought you to being an ally? And then highlight those stories throughout the year, right? Again, on the intranet, share them with the rest of the organization. There is nothing more powerful than when I do fireside chats like this, and I'm the Alex, And I get to ask the questions.
Yeah.
And it's those simple questions about what brought you to this, why, right? And you start to uncover the humanity that's associated also with being an ally, right?
Yeah,
sharing that with others then brings allyship in, because someone will identify with an ally in your organization and say, wow, if Alex is doing that, maybe I should think about, or I know him. Maybe I'll talk to him, or I know her. Maybe I'll, in the next meeting, you continue that conversation. The other thing I would do is have these conversations that you think are difficult with the allies.
Yeah.
In a really safe environment, right? And that is about coming together during Pride and having a conversation about inclusive language. And not doing it from an ally standpoint, doing it from a community standpoint. And this is sort of that reverse mentoring.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's nothing more powerful than allies hearing that there is a bit of learning to happen within our community. Give them the appreciation. So I think that's another really key way of keeping allies engaged.
The realization that actually it's quite complicated navigating gender identity, sexuality, gender expression. All of that's not something that this is my full-time job, and I know nowhere near everything. No one does, and I make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time, and I think
I'm brilliant at them.
Yeah.
And when I make them, they're usually really beautifully recognized, right?
It's high exposure.
But you have to be willing to make a mistake to learn, right? And this is what I tell all senior leaders is, look, if you misstep, people will forgive you, but you have to learn from that misstep.
Absolutely.
If you keep making the same mistake, you're not really paying attention, and stop, right? Just stop doing what you do. So it is about that key learning, right? And for me, you and I had the conversation about the word queer early on, right? And you were sort of like, wow, I've learned something from you, Mark, and I've learned something from Alex, right? And it keeps the conversation going. So don't be afraid to make a mistake. Just don't keep repeating it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we do talks about what does it mean to create LGBT inclusive spaces in organizations, and when we talk about mistakes, there's a little framework I always think about, which is step one is acknowledge that you've made a mistake. You say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make that mistake. I apologize, correct yourself. And then it's, as you say, educate yourself. Well, why did you make that mistake? What was the correct thing to have said? How should you have, what were some of the questions? Go and do your research. And then it's critically following through on that. Don't do that, make that mistake again. Be mindful in the future in those spaces with those people that you made that mistake around in the first place. And then critically, for me, the last point is call out. If you see someone make the same mistake you did, you have a responsibility as an educated person, to call them out, not in an aggressive way, but to say, oh, actually, their pronouns are not that. They identify as gender, non-conforming or non-binary, and it's they them. It's actually their pronouns, and someone go, oh right, I didn't know that. And so what you've done is you've created a space where you can talk about that, and every marginal gain is important. So I think about it in some of those sort of steps as well. It's like it's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them,
and I think it's about being I'm trying to think of the right adjective, being aware that someone has made a mistake versus someone is using language as a weapon.
Oh, 100%.
If someone's using language as a weapon, I will confront that.
Oh, definitely.
At the point in time. But if someone makes a mistake, for me, sometimes it's about getting them after the event, right? Or after it's happened and just saying, hey, Alex, can I have a word?
Yeah.
I don't think you intend, but when you said this, some people in the room had an adverse reaction, and here's why. Yeah. And it's that quiet word, right? That says, in your point, is as important as when we need to confront if language is being used as a weapon. And that's both instances need to be addressed, but it's not always people using it as a weapon, and you've got to be able to, for me, differentiate between the two, and the way you address that has to be proportionate to what's happening at the moment.
No, I completely agree. We've already run over, so maybe we'll kind of wrap up. But I have one question before we go. Is kind of, what question didn't I ask that you think we should cover before we leave?
Yeah, the one question is for me, and it's been more of an indictment than a question, is if I'm really good at my job, right? I'd work myself out of a job. And do I ever think I'll work myself out of a job as head of diversity and inclusion? The answer is no. Right? This work is always going to continue to evolve. And I think we said that in so many ways today.
Yeah, definitely.
I think saying it out loud, right? That not just within the LGBT community, but more broadly across society, whether it's from a personal identification standpoint or a societal standpoint. We talked about different countries. This work will continue. It will continue to evolve. So this idea of working myself out of a job, never going to happen.
I think that makes sense, and I think you're right. It reflects the fact that everyone is at a different point in that journey, personally, organizationally, culturally, regionally, nationally, globally, and that there's always going to be a need to fight, to work on ensuring that everyone is heard and everyone is valid and everyone has, as we said at the beginning, that space to be proud about their identity and to bring their fullest and most authentic selves to work.
Everyone can have a positive impact.
Everyone.
A one-on-one conversation with a friend or a family member, all the way up to, right, taking on government.
Yeah.
Right? We all have the opportunity to have a positive impact. And I would just ask everyone who's been a part of this today to just think about that and where and how they want to have a positive impact for the community.
Yeah, no, I'm lots to think about. I think we'll probably wrap that up. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time and for sharing all of that. It's kind of too much in my head now to really unpack. So I think I'll have to reflect on this.
Listen, Alex, you have a 4-day weekend ahead.
I do. No, absolutely.
Yeah, to be able to reflect on it. So I hope everyone who's joined us today, thank you all. And thank you and Matt and the entire team and the great work that you do at LGBT Great. So thank you for everything that you do, and enjoy the Jubilee weekend. Yeah,
likewise. I'll just say before that we will, this has been recorded and will be made kind of available on our socials. So yeah, we'll share. And if anyone on the call wants to know anything more, drop. I'll put my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out with any feedback or thoughts or reflections. And then I look forward to the next conversation, Mark.
Yep. Anytime. Thanks, Alex.
Well, happy Pride and
speak soon.
Bye. Thank you.